In this session, we're going to explore the life of a man who was a revolutionary. But this revolutionary's arena was not the halls of government or the city streets or the remote village. His arena was the human mind. His name is Albert Einstein, and what he revolutionized was the entire human perspective on space, time, and the nature of the universe. Einstein took the prevailing theories on physics, which dated back 200 years to Isaac Newton, and radically reworked them. His theories, especially his theory on relativity, had a dramatic and immediate impact on human history and the future of scientific thought. For that reason, he is considered one of the greatest physicists of all time. As the world becomes more sophisticated and as scientific learning continues to advance, the genius of Einstein's work has become clearer and clearer, and his theories themselves have become increasingly understandable. Yet he was also widely acclaimed and appreciated in his own time, a favorite of the international press, a revered colleague of the scientific community, and a hero to the public. He was awarded the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1921, and many other prizes and awards, most of which he was quite indifferent to. Einstein's three most famous and important discoveries were the theories of relativity, the equivalence of mass and energy, and the photon theory of light. All these theories proposed entirely new ways of thinking about the physical world, and redefined scientific and philosophic inquiry. Even though many people couldn't understand the theories, they could understand the uniqueness of the creative intellect that conceived them. They could also understand and honor the gentle, modest, and idealistic nature of the man to whom that intellect belonged. Albert Einstein was born in Ulm, a city of southern Germany, on March 14, 1879. When he was only 1 year old, his parents moved to Munich, where his father, Hermann Einstein, set up a small shop for the manufacture of electric supplies. The Einstein house soon became popular in town as a place where one could spend the evenings engaged in sparkling conversation, or listening to music or poetry readings. The house became so well known that visitors from out of town would ask their hosts if they could possibly arrange an invitation to the Einsteins. But for the most part, invitations were unnecessary. The house was open to all. Sometimes Mrs. Einstein would play Mozart or Brahms. Sometimes she would sing folk songs from Germany and Austria. Guests would gather around the piano and sing together. On other evenings, people simply sat in the warm living room talking about the latest scientific inventions, particularly those that might affect sales at Mr. Einstein's shop. Other times, Mr. Einstein would read aloud from great German writers such as Goethe. Young Albert loved these evenings and always dreaded bedtime. As a little boy, Einstein was slow to talk, and his parents worried about him. There is a story that about how at dinner one night, he finally broke his silence and said, "The soup is too hot." His parents, very relieved, asked him why he had not spoken before. Albert replied, because up to now, everything was in order. Albert was shy and took little interest in playing with other children. He had a particular distaste for war, the military, and all the ceremony that went with it. When he saw parades of soldiers, he would say that he never wanted to be one of those. In his words, poor people who followed a leader. In school, Albert didn't perform well. He attended a local Catholic elementary school and had a particularly difficult time with languages. He hated the strict discipline of school and took a dislike to the lesson plans popular in all German schools at the time: memorization, recitation, and mechanical repetitive exercises. At both his elementary and secondary schools, the teachers thought him backward and slow. Today, he would probably be considered learning impaired. When Einstein was 12, he finally found something that sparked his curiosity and imagination. He read a book on geometry. Years later, he explained his excitement over the book, saying it opened for him the possibility of getting certain knowledge of the objects of experience by means of pure thinking. He called this first geometry text a holy booklet, so fully had it awakened him to his own interests and potential. Still a boy, Einstein continued to teach himself mathematics, including differential and integral calculus. He also devoured a 6-volume publication on the history of scientific discoveries. By the time he was 15, he felt assured of his career. He would specialize in mathematics and physics. He said he wanted to solve the great riddle of the universe. Near this time, Einstein's father lost his business, and the family, now bankrupt, decided to leave Germany and make a new start in Italy. Albert was left behind to complete his studies, a decision that made him completely miserable. He had just conceived of a plan to convince a doctor he was having a nervous breakdown and needed a 6-month vacation with his family when the problem was solved for him. The school dismissed him for his poor academic record. Elated, young Einstein joined his family in Milan. The stay in Italy was among his happiest years. Einstein loved the music, the art, and the relaxed atmosphere that contrasted so sharply with the austerity of life in Germany. He decided he wanted to give up his German citizenship. He also decided that to help his family, he would become a teacher. Teaching, he believed, would allow him the freedom to pursue his own studies in physics. Solitude and the time for his own work would be the most important priority for Einstein throughout his whole life. Before he could teach, Albert needed a degree. He applied to an institute in Switzerland, but he failed the entrance exam. Although he did well in mathematics, he flunked botany, zoology, and languages. Now he would have to return to secondary school and do some catch-up. He chose a secondary school, once again, in Switzerland. He studied hard, took the exam once more, and passed. He enrolled in the Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. In Zurich, Einstein's academic record was also mediocre. He met the minimum requirements but spent most of his time pursuing his own studies. Around this time, he met a young woman named Mileva Marek, a Hungarian also very interested in physics. They were married in 1901, the same year Albert became a Swiss citizen. For a few years after graduation, Einstein drifted, sometimes unemployed, sometimes teaching part-time. Then he landed a job as a patent examiner in the Swiss Federal Office, a job which still supplied the precious freedom to research his own theories. He worked on these theories in isolation, without the benefit of contact with other scientists or colleagues. In 1905, at the age of 26, he published his first of three major theories that would shatter conventional views on physics. The title of the piece was On the Electrodynamics of Moving Bodies, but it's come to be known as simply The Special Theory of Relativity. The paper was 30 pages long, had few footnotes, and no references. The thoughts had been all his own. It was this first groundbreaking paper that contained the now famous formula E equals mc squared, which we'll explore more later in this session. When first presented, the paper amazed people with its depth and the immense amount of complex thought it required. It also confused people. It was a difficult theory to grasp. Einstein himself once told about a contest given for the best written explanation of his theory under 3,000 words. The prize was several $1,000s. He remarked, "I'm the only one of my entire circle of friends who is not entering. I don't believe I could do it." 1905 was a productive year for Einstein. After he published the special theory of relativity, he then published 4 more papers, all of them highly significant. One of them described his remarkable theory of light quanta, called today the photon theory. It would later earn him a Nobel Prize. In a period of only 1 year, Einstein had founded and advanced 2 theories that are today the basis of all physics. Public recognition and the value of Einstein's contribution wasn't immediate. It took 3 years before he had the opportunity to gain the audience he needed. In 1908, he was asked to lecture on his theory of relativity to a group of eminent scientists in Salzburg, Austria. Shortly after that, he was asked to serve as associate professor at the University of Zurich. It was now 1909, and Einstein was 30 years old. He said later that before he arrived at the university in Zurich, he had never known a real physicist. Now he was in the world of academia, and he would remain there for the rest of his life. It was not always a comfortable world for Einstein. He disliked academic politics, the constant meetings, and the campus gossip. But it also offered him free time and an atmosphere in which he could pursue his studies. By 1911, he was a full professor, lecturing at other colleges, in Prague, in Germany, and back in Switzerland. He joined the faculty of the Institute of Technology, where he had studied as a student himself. In 1913, as the machines of war were gearing up all over Europe, Einstein was asked to join the prestigious Prussian Academy of Science. An acceptance would mean he would have to return to Germany. But an acceptance also meant he could accept a position as the director of the new physics department at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin, the most prestigious physics university in the world. Einstein couldn't refuse. The offer came with a promise he would have no official duties and complete freedom to pursue his own interests. The decision to return to Germany marked the end of Einstein's marriage. His wife, Mileva, had been unhappy for a long time. She was frustrated at the limitations of being a wife and mother to their 2 boys, and was anxious to resume a career. Furthermore, she disliked Germany and refused to move, although she felt it was an opportunity that Einstein must take. The 2 agreed to separate, and sometime later they divorced. In Germany, Einstein had all the time he needed to complete his latest work, the theory of general relativity. For the rest of his life, he would work diligently at expanding this theory, a goal that proved unattainable. The fame Einstein achieved during the 17 years he worked in Germany was phenomenal. Both the public and the scientific community lionized him. When World War I broke out, he was one of the few who was able to protest it and still maintain his popularity. He received so many honorary degrees and appointments that he lost track of them. He received his Nobel Prize in Physics in 1922, not for his theory on relativity, which was still considered too controversial, but for his discovery the same year of the photoelectric effect. The prize included an award of $50,000. Einstein sent half of it to his first wife, Mileva, in appreciation for her help and love during the hard times early in their marriage. The other half he donated to charity. Later he won the Copley Medal of the English Royal Society, became an honorary citizen of Prussia, and had a tower erected in his name in Potsdam. On his 50th birthday, he had to flee Berlin to avoid the extensive festivities in his honor. But in the 1930s, things began to change in Germany, changes that would affect all of Europe and the world, changes that would affect Albert Einstein. By the time 1933 arrived and Adolf Hitler came to power, Albert Einstein had become a national symbol. Germans felt that he was yet another example of the superiority of the German mind and the German people. This created a problem because Einstein, although he was by no means orthodox, was also a Jew. So in spite of his undeniable brilliance and success, the Nazis could not permit him to be revered. Instead, they burned his books in public, railed against his work at public meetings, and filled the newspapers with angry editorials. His theory of relativity had always been controversial and subject to criticism. But now, when it was criticized, it was because the writer was a Jew. Einstein boarded a ship and left for the land of liberty. In the United States, too, Einstein was famous. When he arrived, his boat was met by a throng of reporters. The little German physicist was always considered good human interest because he was a genius, and furthermore, he was an eccentric genius. He had long, untamed white hair. He always wore turtleneck sweaters, but he never wore socks. His pants were too baggy, and everywhere he went, he carried a violin. There was a reason for his famously careless dress. Einstein deliberately spent as little time as possible on the trivial so he could have more time for his work. Still, in spite of his sometimes sloppy and distracted ways, the brilliance always shined through. A friend once said, if you could meet and talk to Einstein without knowing that he was Einstein, you would still be impressed by his brilliant eyes, his sense of humor, and by the fact that whatever he might say would be the product of his own mind, uninfluenced by the shrieks of the outside world. While Einstein was in the United States, Hitler became head of the German government. Einstein promptly resigned from the Prussian Academy and vowed never to return to Germany. The Nazis immediately confiscated his property. When 100 Nazi professors published a book condemning his theory of relativity, Einstein was indifferent. He said, if I were wrong, one professor would have been enough. Shortly after this, Einstein moved to England, but he returned to the United States when he was offered a position at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, New Jersey. It was an incredible offer. The terms were a lifetime professorship that required no teaching whatsoever, and Einstein could name his salary. Einstein took the offer, but the salary he requested was so low that the Institute had to raise it simply to maintain their own standards. Einstein settled in the States with a comment that, as long as I have any choice, I will stay only in a country where political liberty, toleration, and equality of all citizens before the law is the rule. In 1940, at the age of 61, he became a United States citizen. Einstein's second wife, Elsa, joined him in America, and they settled into a small house in Princeton and into a regular and reliable routine. Einstein rose at 8 o'clock in the morning and left the house before 9 o'clock. He walked for a mile and a half to work through the campus of Princeton University and along a country road to the Institute. As he walked, people stared. He was famous, and besides, he was such a comical sight in his mismatched clothes, and his long wavy hair frizzled out at the ends. Those who had the courage to say hello always received a broad smile. Einstein walked in rain or shine, snow or hail, and he was never known to wear hats or boots or to carry an umbrella. He also never noticed the attention he attracted. His mind already was in his work. His office at the Institute was on the second floor in a spacious two-room suite. He used the small, less luxurious one that had been designed for an assistant. He would sit with a pad in his lap and fill sheet after sheet with figures. Einstein was on a quest, a quest that consumed him the entire second half of his life, and which he never completed. That quest was for unity. Einstein believed there must be a single theory, a unified system of mathematical laws that governed all the forces in the universe. His colleagues thought this search futile and mourned over the time he was wasting. But Einstein remained adamant. He once said the most incomprehensible thing about the world is that it is comprehensible. Shortly after noon, Einstein would return home for lunch, usually in a state of distraction. He said, "I think and think for months, for years. 99 times the conclusion is false. The 100th time, I am right." After lunch, Einstein would work at home in his study with the same pad and pencil. As he was working out his ideas, he would often pace the room, dropping and scattering his papers on the already cluttered floor. It was one of the tasks of his secretary to find these papers and save them for future reference. At the end of the day, Einstein sometimes played the violin. He had a preference for Mozart and Bach. He was an accomplished player and sometimes gave concerts to raise money for a cause he believed in. Once, when invited to speak at a hotel in Prague, he instead rose up and said, "I don't think anyone here really wants to hear me make a speech or deliver a lecture on my theory of relativity. So instead of making a speech, I'm going to play the violin for you." He then proceeded to delight the audience with his renditions of Mozart and Bach. Einstein also played the piano, but this he always did in private. Although Einstein always remained as shy as he'd been as a child, he did like to entertain at home. He would sit with friends and discuss not just physics, but politics and philosophy. He seldom had the time to read, but did have a partiality for Dostoevsky, to whom he gave the ultimate compliment when he said, "He gives me more pleasure than Gauss," the great mathematician. Einstein's favorite pastime, when not working, was sailing on a nearby lake. His 18-foot sailboat was his most cherished possession. In general, life in Princeton was pleasant and peaceful. He once wrote to Queen Elizabeth describing the academic town as a wonderful little spot, a quaint and ceremonious little village of puny demigods on stilts. But life was not all pleasantness. As the world plunged into war at the turn of the decade, Einstein would confront a personal crisis of enormous proportions. Although always a pacifist, he now found his ideals being put to the test by a dictator whose megalomania and inhumanity threatened the entire world. He reversed himself publicly, admitting that in this particular and very grave case, war was justifiable. He even helped raise money for it in bond drives, and he donated his services to charitable organizations that were helping the large number of refugees who were fleeing Germany for the United States. In writing of the war at that time, he said, "The ancient Jehovah is still abroad. Alas, he slays the innocent along with the guilty, whom he strikes so fearsomely blind that they can feel no sense of guilt. We are dealing with an epidemic delusion which, having caused infinite suffering, will one day vanish and become a monstrous and incomprehensible source of wonderment to later generations." Then he confronted another crisis, one caused by his seminal work over 30 years before on the subject of relativity. His formula, E=mc², had eventually led scientists to split the atom, unleashing a power that they well knew could be channeled into the most deadly weapon the world had ever seen. Now his colleagues begged him to write a letter to President Roosevelt proposing that this weapon be made. Physicists in Germany, they warned him, were already working on it and had discovered the fission of uranium. If the United States didn't act fast, this weapon would soon be in the hands of the madman Adolf Hitler. Einstein asked only a few questions, then he changed the subject. But later that day, he sat down and wrote the following words and more to the president. "In the last 4 months, it has been made probable through the work of Joliot in France, as well as Fermi and Szilard in America, that it may become possible to set up a nuclear chain reaction in a large mass of uranium, by which vast amounts of power and large quantities of new radium-like elements would be generated. Now it appears almost certain that this could be achieved in the immediate future. This new phenomenon would also lead to the construction of bombs, and it is conceivable, though much less certain, that extremely powerful bombs of a new type may thus be constructed. A single bomb of this type, carried by boat and exploded in a port, might very well destroy the whole port together with some of the surrounding territory. However, such bombs might very well prove to be too heavy for transportation by air. I understand that Germany has actually stopped the sale of uranium from the Czechoslovakian mines which she has taken over. That she should have taken such early action might be understood on the ground that the son of the German Undersecretary of State is attached to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin, where some of the American work on uranium is now being repeated. Roosevelt took immediate action after receiving Einstein's letter and established the Manhattan Project, whereby scientists could work full-time to create the bomb before Germany did. On July 16, 1945, the first test of the atom bomb took place in a remote section of New Mexico. The test was successful. Einstein and many other scientists would be haunted ever after for the role they played in the dropping of the atom bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, even when the role was inadvertent. Einstein went out of his way to direct people towards productive use of the atom. He was one of the first to point out to the medical profession that harnessing of the atom might have potential in future treatments of disease. He seemed to work hard at his attempts to balance the negative results of his discovery with the possibility of positive results. Meanwhile, he continued to work on new theories, although that work was becoming harder to accomplish. It was inevitable that the admiration Einstein inspired would bring an endless stream of visitors, fans, young aspiring scientists, and curiosity seekers to his door, and this is exactly what happened. Elsa served as his protector, gently turning away the uninvited and screening his calls and invitations. Her loyalty to him and to his work never wavered. When someone once asked her if she understood her husband's theory of relativity, Elsa responded, "No, but I know he can be trusted." After Elsa died in 1936, her daughter from a previous marriage came to live with Einstein and stepped into Elsa's shoes as the guardian of his privacy. It was one of the biggest challenges of Einstein's later years to find the time and concentration for his own work in the midst of great public attention. Although he led a somewhat ascetic and reclusive life, Einstein was by no means out of touch with the world. He was very fully involved in several controversial issues of great importance to the world. One of these was Zionism, a cause to which he dedicated himself passionately. He felt the real tragedy of the Jews was their lack of a community, and so he supported and worked for the goal of making Palestine a Jewish nation. He was not intensely nationalistic about it, and he held no religious orthodoxy, but he was committed. He was also one of a handful of prominent people who spoke up against the communist witch hunts of the McCarthy era, when a group of congressmen required citizens to testify about their past and present political activities and beliefs. These witnesses were also required to report on the political leanings of their friends. Einstein's comment at the time was, "It is shameful for a blameless citizen to submit to such an inquisition which violates the spirit of the Constitution." Einstein also continued to oppose war and militarism, and one of his favorite points to make was that although there were over 100 colleges in the United States that offered courses on warfare, there were only one or two that offered courses on peacemaking. Even though Einstein had once said, "Politics is for the moment, an equation is forever," he nevertheless felt compelled to serve humanity in other areas besides science. Shortly before his death, Einstein joined many other prominent people, including the philosopher Bertrand Russell, in a declaration against war. They focused particularly on the next and future weapon, the H-bomb. This bomb, they argued, could end the entire human race, and no treaties between nations could guarantee it would not be used. Their conclusion, the only choice was to prohibit war entirely. Einstein worked throughout his later years for the cause of nuclear disarmament, and even established the Einstein War Resisters International Fund. He grew less and less patient with statesmen and politicians, saying, "They have cheated, fooled us. Hundreds of millions of people in Europe and America, billions of men and women yet to be born, have been and are being cheated, traded, and tricked out of their lives and health and well-being." He discussed with Sigmund Freud his view that people must have an innate compulsion for hatred and destruction, to which Freud agreed. Meanwhile, he discussed with the famous Hindu poet, Rabindranath Tagore, the nature of truth. Tagore held that truth was realized through man. Einstein instead maintained that scientific truth must be conceived as a valid truth independent of man. "I cannot prove I am right in this," he said, "but that is my religion." Accused of atheism at various times in his life, Einstein firmly denied it, saying he believed in Spinoza's God, who reveals himself in the harmony of what exists. In 1947, following an illness, Einstein's doctors discovered he had an aneurysm, a small ballooning in a weak wall of an artery in his heart. Within a few years, his condition grew worse, but still he managed to put in several hours of work a day at the Institute. He continued a few years like this, and then in 1955, he began to grow frail. His legs were so weak that his customary walk to the university became harder and harder. His fingers were so weak he could no longer play his beloved violin. Then he began to suffer stomach pains, but he rejected the idea of surgery. saying he had too much work to do. He was still working steadily in his attempt to find a unified theory of physics. Soon Einstein collapsed and a bed was put up in his study. Specialists wanted to operate, saying there was a 50-50 chance they could succeed in repairing the artery, but Einstein would have none of it. His view of death was simply that it happened to everyone and was not particularly important. A few days later, doctors insisted on taking him to the hospital, and shortly after midnight that day, April 18, 1955, the weak artery broke and Albert Einstein died. He was 76 years old. He had already left instructions on what was to be done. There was to be no funeral, no grave, and no monument. His brains could be used for research, but he wanted his body cremated. His wishes were carried out, and his ashes were scattered in a nearby river. Albert Einstein's brain was carefully examined under a microscope, and although no details of this examination were ever released, it was made known that the doctors found nothing unique in the brain's size, weight, or formation. The expansive imagination and brilliant reasoning that had created such monumental work was stored in some recess inaccessible to science. Since his death, the work of Albert Einstein has only inspired more admiration and awe. New learning has only helped to confirm the importance and accuracy of what he determined so many years ago. Einstein's first great work was the paper he wrote in 1905, now referred to as the special theory of relativity. It is not an easy theory to understand nor to describe. Once Einstein himself was asked to give a lecture on it to an audience in Bern, Switzerland. He started his remarks by saying, "I'm sure you will all find the theory very simple." The roar of laughter that greeted this remark continued for a full 5 minutes. The theory showed that there is no fixed or absolute standard for comparison for judging the motion of the Earth or other moving systems. The only movement that can be detected and measured is relative movement, the change of a position of one body in relationship to another. That was the first premise. It then led to a conclusion. The conclusion was the famous E equals mc squared. With this formula, he said that mass and energy are interchangeable, that mass represents stores of energy, and that energy contains a small mass. Thus, mass can be converted to energy and vice versa. The rate of exchange between mass and energy is that energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. For instance, one could take an atom of uranium and break it into 2 pieces in a laboratory. The 2 pieces together would weigh less than the original single atom. So there would be extra energy that wasn't there before. The missing mass, m, has turned into an amount of energy, E, given by the velocity or speed of light, which is c. Because c is so large and c squared is even larger, even a minute amount of mass equals an enormous amount of energy. His work therefore revealed the reservoirs of energy held within the atom, and also supplied the means for calculating the amount of it, thus paving the way for scientists who split the atom 34 years later. His formula is the basic principle behind the operation of nuclear reactors. Shortly after publishing the special theory of relativity, Einstein published his next work, the photon theory. In a single stroke, this work revolutionized the theory of light. The theory held that if the speed of light is constant, and if all natural laws are the same, then both time and motion are found to be relative to the observer. This paper demonstrated the photoelectric effect. That is, it showed that light, under certain circumstances, exists as pockets of radiant energy. He said the energy carried in a beam of light is divided into tiny little bits called photons. The energy of each photon depends on the frequency of the light, in other words, on its color. Blue light has a high frequency, so its photons carry more energy than the photons in a red light, which has a lower frequency. This theory created a bombshell in scientific circles, because people had previously perceived light as a wave phenomenon traveling through space. The idea that it had its energy in separate little packets was at first difficult to grasp. Einstein's paper was an enormous development in the area of quantum theory, and it is the paper that won him his Nobel Prize. Einstein also published a third paper in this year, 1905, in which he put forth his theory of Brownian motion. In this paper, he accounted for the apparently random movement of pollen in fluids and provided strong evidence for the existence of atom-sized molecules. There had already been much theoretical discussion of molecules, but it was Einstein who offered the first concrete evidence of their existence, later elaborated by other scientists. 8 years after these pioneering works, Einstein released a third, the general theory of relativity. The core of this theory was that gravitation is not a force, as Newton had believed, but a curved field in a space-time continuum, created by the presence of mass. Gravitation determines the curvature of space and time. This paper put forth a unified theory of gravitation. It suggested that light was bent by the sun's gravitational pull, but that the only way this theory could be proved was through photography. He explained that proof further. He said that as light passes near the sun, for example, it should be deflected by an amount which can be calculated. So when we see a star near the sun, it should appear slightly displaced from its normal position. But these stars near the sun are completely hidden from human sight because of the brightness of the sun. Only when the sun is hidden, as in a total eclipse, would one be able to measure the displacement of these stars. 3 years later, in 1916, there was a total eclipse of the sun, and scientists set out to test Einstein's theory. Observers were sent to the two places on Earth where the eclipse could best be seen and photographed, northern Brazil and an island in the Gulf of Guinea off Africa. Their photographs were studied for months, and astronomers discussed all possible errors and interpretations. Then the astronomers, along with mathematicians and other scientists, announced to an excited audience at the Royal Astronomical Society in London that the photographs completely verified Einstein's theory. The rays of light were bent as they passed close to the sun. The president of the society called it one of the greatest achievements in the history of human thought. It is the greatest discovery in connection with gravitation since first Newton enunciated his principles. And headlines around the world screamed, "Revolution in science, Newtonian principles overthrown." Later, when a pupil asked him, "What would you have said if there had been no confirmation of this kind?" Einstein replied, "I would have been obliged to pity our dear God. The theory is correct." For the rest of his life, he devoted himself to extending this unified theory of gravity to include electromagnetic forces, the first step towards finding the common laws governing the behavior of everything in the universe, from molecules to planets. He was unable to do so. Even without proof, however, scientists today still refer with awe to Einstein's great dream, a grand unification of physical theory. There was further work of Einstein that he himself accomplished, and also work that developed from what he'd accomplished. Although he took no part in the work on the atom bomb and knew of the bomb only after Hiroshima had been destroyed, his name is ever associated with the advent of the atomic age. He eagerly joined other scientists in seeking ways to prevent further use of the bomb and to transform the atomic age into one of human benefits. Advances in medicine, nutrition, lighting, and heating have all occurred because of our ability to harness the atom. The life of Albert Einstein might be the ultimate example of the misunderstood genius. He first gained fame as a German scientist, although he had an aversion to nationalism. He was then persecuted as a Jew, although he didn't practice the Jewish religion. Next, he was accused of atheism, although he many times stated his belief in God, a God who reveals himself in the harmony of all being. Finally, his name has always been linked with the development of the world's most deadly weapon, although he himself was a pacifist and fought for years for the cause of disarmament. It is a disturbing irony that this idealistic man's most famous equation had its most spectacular proof in the creation of instruments for destruction. Einstein could understand the most complex and obscure elements of physics. He had almost intuitive perception into the physical world, and he could create and comprehend theories that baffled even the most sophisticated. But he could not understand or fathom the extremes of human behavior. The real understanding of Albert Einstein lies in what he came to symbolize to the entire world, the pure quality and potential of human intellect and thought, the creative ability of individuals who live in free societies, the passionate sense of justice and social responsibility, and the conviction of order and purpose within the universe. Einstein believed the physical world was precisely engineered. God does not play dice with the universe, he once said. With this belief, which fueled all he did and strove to do, Einstein forever changed man's view of his world.
This is the end of the session.